Hello everyone, my name is Sara and I am the co-editor-in-chief here at NOVAsia magazine. Today I'm joined with two guests who will now introduce themselves.
Hi, my name is Erin Underwood. I am a second semester PIC major, which is International Cooperation, and I'm from America.
Hello everyone, I'm Simone. I'm the co-editor-in-chief of NOVAsia as well, and I'm in my fourth semester of Korean Studies, and I am from Melbourne, Australia.
I am from Toronto, Canada. I forgot to mention that. In today's episode of the podcast, we will be discussing single mothers in South Korea and also adoption in South Korea. Erin and Simone both have experience in this field. I do not. So I'm excited to learn a little bit about some of the organizations that are here in South Korea, kind of how they run and just their experiences in them. So perhaps, Erin, we can start with you.
Sure.
So you were involved with an adoption agency, or was it?
It wasn't an agency. It was just an organization that helped adoptees once they returned back to Korea and helped them to adjust living in Korea.
Okay. Would you say that's common for Koreans to return, or?
It's very common for Koreans to return, but when I was living in America, I didn't know many Koreans that were adopted that wanted to return to Korea. But after living in Korea, I met a lot more adoptees that did return and want to remain in Korea for the rest of their lives. So I was kind of surprised by that, actually.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Do you think they were affected or influenced by the programs that were run through these organizations, or what kind of return programs were they?
I don't know if it was really the programs as much as just they felt more comfortable living here, because they looked like the people that were around them and they wanted to get more involved in the culture and the society than when they're in America. They don't look like everybody that's around them. So that's mainly what I've heard from other adoptees. They just feel more comfortable living here and want to know more about the culture that they didn't grow up in.
So does the organization, how do they help Korean adoptees?
So there is one organization that's named GOAL, and that entire program is run by specifically Korean adoptees.
Okay.
And so they do trips, and they give the other month they gave away boxes of for COVID. So they gave a bunch of different products to adoptees, and then they give they do kimchi making classes, Korean classes, and there's another organization, Nest, that does do language courses for people and trips all around Korea and stuff like that. So it's just different types of activities that can help you feel a little bit more comfortable living in Korea.
Okay. Do you know, from your experience working at this agency, if adoptees, how they feel if they don't necessarily speak Korean and come to Korea?
Even for my own personal experience, it's very uncomfortable. But it's kind of surprising to me because when I moved to Korea, I feel very uncomfortable not knowing Korean and being Korean. But then a lot of adoptees I know don't want to learn Korean as much and aren't as motivated because they kind of have a mindset of, well, I didn't grow up here, so I don't have to know the language.
Okay.
And so the people who were when I was working in the agency, a lot of people who applied for the Korean language program were actually abroad in America or in Europe or wherever. So I found that very surprising. And it's a lot of the younger people that don't want to learn Korean, but it's the older people that want to learn Korean. So it's it depends on the person, but talking to them, they're not as uncomfortable with not knowing the language.
Do you think that's because there's quite a good support system through these organizations, as you said, but also, the world is kind of globalizing, and Korea especially are very invested in English education. So do you think that could be a reason why?
That could definitely be a reason why, but I think some people hold more of a resentment, and it's kind of they want to embrace the culture, but they don't want to embrace it fully because they just hold this resentment and kind of not anger, but just they don't feel the obligation to learn it because they're well, I'm adopted, so you guys should be accustomed to me kind of mindset, but it depends on the person. Some people really are motivated to learn, like myself, but other people aren't as motivated.
I guess it's just all like an individual journey and depends on where you come from as well, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, and I think it's people who actually grew up around more adoptees feel more comfortable being outspoken that they don't need to learn Korean. And people who didn't grow up as surrounded by as many adoptees or as many Koreans feel more obligated to learn Korean is something that I've actually kind of realized too.
Okay.
Yeah. But yeah.
Interesting.
That's really cool.
Any other questions?
No, like you mentioned goal, and actually how I kind of I volunteered briefly for an organization for single mothers and like families in Korea. And how I kind of got into that was because I attended a seminar at Goal.
Oh, really?
And it was like, I think the speaker or the main lecturer was a lawyer, and like there was a professor as well. And the professor was an adoptee, a Korean American adoptee, I believe.
Okay.
So like just going through to the seminars, because I'm really interested in adoption issues and adoption studies, because I have quite a few friends who are adoptees from Australia, and they are also like adoption studies scholars.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how I became interested in it, and that's how I found Goal, and I found the other organization that I volunteered for. So I think like it is like a good thing that they are trying to reach more people as well, who are not adoptees, but like who are allies or scholars. But do you think there are like, or what do you perceive the kind of like societal situation in Korea to be like? Do you think there should be more education on like these issues and acceptance and awareness?
So I think I do like how Goal is like adoptee oriented and everything like that. But I think one of the problems is that it's just about adoptees and it doesn't reach out to people like Korean society about like these are adoptees,
issues.
like these are their issues. Like they try, like they go to seminars and they fight for stuff for adoptees with the government and everything like that. But like there needs to be more awareness to the adoptees, because within like these little organizations that are for adoptees, it's just adoptees that are involved pretty much. And so other people need to be more, like the programs need to include some Koreans to make them more adjusted and more accustomed to adoptees, because like from my experience, like a lot of Koreans have never met an adoptee before. But there's so many adoptees in Korea.
Yeah, it's not a small number after the war, right? It was like in the hundreds of thousands.
Yeah.
Koreans that were adopted overseas.
It's thousands of people that were adopted. And a lot of them have come back to Korea, but you wouldn't know who's adopted and who's not. And Koreans are very shocked when they first meet an adoptee, because they're like, this is the first time I've ever met somebody adopted. And so I think if these programs made it so that adoptees and Koreans could meet and just become more accustomed, that would be really good. But that's kind of what the Korean language courses do. They have Koreans teaching adoptees too.
So you said that like Koreans were shocked when they meet adoptees. Would you say there might be like a taboo around it or a negative stigma, or is it just shock?
I don't know if it's a negative stigma, but from my experience, every time somebody has met me and they're like, oh, you're adopted, their first thing is saying, I'm so sorry. And I'm like, oh, okay. Like, I'm not really sorry. Like, I had like a great life and everything like that. So, but then I've asked them to explain it a little bit more, and they just say like, culturally, they feel really bad as a society that they couldn't raise us.
They couldn't take care of their people,
us.
Right?
Yeah. But, and I understand that, but also it's like, it kind of has a negative viewpoint to it when you say like, oh, I'm so sorry that because it's not, I don't think international adoptions are a negative thing. And I know some people do, but I don't think international adoptions are a negative thing. And so I think some Koreans think that if you're adopted, it's like almost something's wrong with you, and that's why you were adopted.
Like there's some kind of shame associated with it.
Yeah, and they're kind of like curious, like, oh, what could it be that like provoked it? Like what's wrong with their family that they were put up for adoption? Or what's wrong with the person that they were put up for adoption? Because a lot of the adoptees were put up for adoption because something within their family or mental disorders or physical disabilities or something like that, and that's why they were put up for adoption. So I think it's kind of like sometimes it's a negative viewpoint.
Okay.
Yeah.
I remember reading an article about GOAL, in terms of the president at the time invited one of the representatives of GOAL to come speak about it at the Blue House. And it was during the anniversary of when, it was in recognition of all the children who were adopted after the war, and kind of like congratulating GOAL on all their efforts and like thanking them for doing the work that they hadn't done. Do you think stuff like that would help Koreans like start recognizing adoptions, or would you say that has a more negative impact because of how they're phrasing it?
I think like it's kind of like I hear so many adoptees say like recognize us, like know that we were put up for adoption, but I do think it kind of has a negative light to it, because it makes it seem like we're this sad story that we're just shipped off to another country. But people don't understand, like all the time, every time somebody finds I'm adopted, they say I'm sorry, and then they ask me, oh, are your parents nice? Were your parents good to you? And I'm like, that's a very uncomfortable question. But it kind of is like, so you kind of think that just because I grew up in a different country, that maybe my parents weren't great. And so I think that it's good. The idea behind it's really good because they want to bring more awareness, but I think it also...
like it's a double-edged sword.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of like, almost like shaming us. I don't know. Yeah, it's a double-edged sword. I don't know how to explain it. But yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you for bringing that. That was such a big question. I was just like, please now explain everything that's involved with this. And write a 4-page paper, a single space, 12-point font.
I'm doing it now for one of my papers for class about adoption. So I mean, I've already done all the research, so I got it.
Okay, so Simone, we're gonna switch to you now.
I'm not an adoptee, by the way.
Pressure is on.
Disclaimer.
So you were with an organization that worked with
single and unwed mothers and families.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
And what were you doing there? Like,
so I was like just briefly part of the volunteer group for English tutoring for some of the children, because as you can imagine, support for single mothers in South Korea is not a lot. I think it was like, I was reading a paper once and it was like something about the budget of the like Ministry of Gender Equality and like Women and Family, of like the total national budget was like 0.001% or something like this. So yeah, it was just mainly to kind of give support to these children and kind of helping them further their education. Not saying that they don't have these resources or support, but I would imagine for a lot of these families, because their mother is the full-time breadwinner, perhaps like their children don't have as much like support or resources in their studies compared to like other, like, you know, like nuclear families, I suppose. So like, yeah, every weekend I would just help this girl in primary school to do some of her English homework, and it was very nice. She was like very sweet, and her mother was always very thankful, so it's very like heartwarming to be able to kind of help.
So you got to like interact with both kind of like the child, but then also kind of...
Mostly it was the child, but because of like the COVID situation, I assumed that they would have done this like at the headquarters or in the community centers, but because of the COVID situation, it was all done online. And actually there were quite a few volunteers who were volunteering from overseas, like the States or Canada or Europe as well, because they could just jump online and help as an English tutor. So I was like posted with them. The family, I believe, was like in Ilsan or Incheon.
Okay.
So they were not in Seoul. Yeah.
Interesting.
So
I've read a little bit about kind of how single mothers are like treated in South Korea, and how some of them feel the need to hide it, or like hide the fact they're unwed with with a child.
Right.
that's not, I don't know what Australia is like in terms of.
I think so I'm not Korean and I didn't grow up in Korea, so I can't really say for the Korean situation. But I think compared to a country like Australia, I think there is definitely like a higher degree of societal like taboo in Korea. So for example, in Australia, I had a lot of friends who had like separated parents or like single parent families, and it was like never really a big deal. It was just kind of like, oh yeah, my parents are separated, like that's it. And people would be like, okay, cool. But I think there's also so I did an internship at a women's organization in Australia as well. So I think there are a lot more kind of like NGOs and resources and support, as well as like more governmental, like local government and ministry supports for just women and children in general. And I think social work in Australia is kind of considered to be quite like a professional and noble kind of career. But I know some people who work in social work in Korea, and they say it's kind of not really as much of an established field as a career or a job in Korea. So maybe it's just like a societal, like a governmental perception that this kind of work is not really beneficial to pursue, maybe.
Do you think, well, actually I was doing research because for my paper it's talking about single mothers, because some adoptees say that they think that if the government supported single parents more, then they wouldn't have to put their children up for adoption or go into orphanages and stuff like that, which I do agree with.
I think so too.
And I read that the government gives they give couples $1,000. They give single parents only $500. They get half the price just because they're not a couple. They don't have like a partner.
Yeah.
And so I just don't think that's really fair. But do you think that if there was more governmental support for single parents in Korea, then there wouldn't be as many children put into orphanages and put up for adoption? That might be a very...
I think it depends because it's not just the fact about like financial support. Because I read that a few years ago, the government introduced a special adoption act in Korea. And this was kind of to discourage giving your children up.
Yeah.
Because like abortion is technically illegal in Korea, right? I think. So
no, it's legal now.
It's legal now?
No, it's legal.
Like as of this year, right?
Yeah, it recently became legal. But it's still like really hidden.
Right.
You wouldn't
tell people like, I had an abortion.
Yeah, exactly. And doctors aren't like, here, sign up for an abortion here.
It's
but
like,
I'm
to my
pretty
clinic,
sure it's legal now.
Yeah.
Okay.
But anyway, this special adoption law I read, it was kind of like to be able to give your children up for adoption, the mother had to go through a legal process through like the local court. And in that case, it would no longer be a private transaction between the adoption agency and the mother, because you have to go through the legal system. It's also no longer anonymized. So on one hand, the government tried to enact this act and this law to discourage like people from giving up their children. But because of the whole like societal taboo, and it's just not seen as like a public thing to do, like I think a lot of women were scared to go through that legal process and have their names like released to the public and have everyone know. So as a result, I read that the cases of like child abandonment skyrocketed after this law was introduced. And that was why I think a few years ago there was like a lot of coverage on something called like the baby boxes that churches, like I think it started with one church that enacted it's like a little post box outside of the church that was like a warming box where women could just like leave their babies there without being found out, and then the church would take in the child and take care of them. And I think that was kind of one of the results of the law. So I think it's not just the financial support that the government needs to look at. It's like other related policies and other related education programs and schemes, because it's not just like a thing of giving money and then the problem is going to go away. It's, I think, generational change and generational mindset and education and perception needs to happen.
Right.
To kind of combat the issue.
Because I heard that South Korea is pretty much trying to stop all international adoptions.
Right.
Completely.
So they also, I read that they're trying to encourage domestic adoptions as well.
Yeah.
Especially for children with disabilities.
Is that a thing? Like, I honestly, I don't know. So, like, domestic adoptions in South Korea, is it really, really uncommon? Like,
It's pretty uncommon. Like, I think I've heard 2.
oh, okay.
And it's just from a person says, oh, I know a person who knows a person who knows a person that did domestic adoption.
Or if it's done, it's like very secretive. You know,
Yeah.
like you will never tell this child that they were adopted.
Yeah, which
You'll
is
be
super
like-
unfair.
You'd be like, oh, because you know, like you see those Korean dramas, and there's always comes out that, oh, the heir to the corporation is actually adopted. Oh my
I wish
gosh,
that was my
you know?
case.
Like,
I wish that had been my case. I say to my parents all the time, like, if only Angelina Jolie had adopted me. I just had to wait a few more years to be adopted.
well,
and
her son is
Is
now
that Underwood?
his son studies at our university.
Hey, Maddox.
So, Maddox, the eligible bachelorette, you can marry into the family.
I'm an Underwood, so. Oh gosh, yeah. I mean, it's so. I'm still a little bit bitter. But yeah, so South Korea is trying to stop international adoptions, but I don't know, because I feel like that just will lead to more abandonment, or like people abandoning their children. I don't think it's going to lead to more domestic adoptions. So I don't know how that's going to work out for them with that situation, especially because they just signed into the Hague Convention, which is supposed to encourage adoptions in children growing up within families. And so I'm curious to how they're going to go about encouraging domestic adoptions, because they're also trying to increase the birth rate.
Yes.
So it's like, how are you going to increase the birth rate but also encourage domestic adoptions at the same time?
Yeah, I was reading that Japan and Korea are in this competition to see who can get the lowest birth rate, apparently. So, as far as I know, I think South Korea is winning.
Yeah, South Korea is like 0.75 or something.
They're below
below
what
1.
you need to repopulate a country.
No, it's below 1 child per
Yeah.
family.
It's
So
like 2060, the year 2060, there's going to be like no Koreans left. And I'm like,
You guys are going extinct.
I guess so. I don't know.
yeah, no, that's an interesting point though. How are they going to combat the aging population and low fertility rate with the domestic adoption issues?
Right.
Mm.
I'm not sure. Korea, can you answer?
Yeah.
So that's a question for you guys. Please leave it in the comments down below. How are we going to solve this issue that's currently occurring?
President Moon, if you're watching this, can you just do it?
Taking notes at the Blue House.
Slide into NOVAsia's DMs. We're happy to help.
I'll be happy to come talk to you at the Blue House.
Have a full state dinner.
Yeah. Only English. Any other questions?
I don't know. I think because I know like Canada doesn't have a declining birth rate, but it's started to become an issue, and there are talks that are currently happening about lack of support for mothers in terms of not having enough daycare, or not being nationwide daycare, in terms of every child can go to daycare. It is not going to be expensive. And then that way mothers can work and have children and not have to make that decision. And then also financial support is one of them. But I think like just support is also really necessary. Do you think South Korea, for either of you, will ever come to that point where they will try and implement these types of things? Or for single parents, or is the nuclear family like very important to the culture? And
I think
society.
that the government can try and push and like do these things for single parents, but culturally I think Korea is pretty behind. And I don't think they are very supportive of it. I think the younger generations are more supportive or more understanding, but the older generations don't really have a grasp on it, and they can't understand single parents, and I don't understand why.
I think to combat this issue as well, there just needs to be better like sex education in Korea in general.
Oh gosh, yeah.
Because like there are so many like not what are they called? Like, not documentaries, but like TV shows? TV documentaries, I guess.
Yeah.
And like, I've seen so many where it's like, oh yeah, this young couple, like the girl gets pregnant because they did not have protected sex, and then they just have to get married, but they can't finish university because like you just cannot go to university pregnant, and then the guy has to drop out and they have to start a business or have to start working. So it's like, I think that whole issue. But then going back to like support for single parents as well, I think it's an issue in Korea because in Australia we have like different categories of jobs, right? You have like casual work and then part-time work and full-time work. But in Korea it's kind of like you have like alba, which is like part-time but like fast food or coffee shop part-time.
Yeah.
And then you have like contract work, which is really insecure and unstable, and then full-time work. So I think for single families to survive in Korea, it's like very difficult because you do not have this option of like part-time job or like part-time professional work plus the government subsidy, which like I'm not saying Australia is perfect, but I think like it is much easier for even nuclear families to parent because you can have, you know, like you can negotiate your work hours more so.
I agree 100% about sex education in Korea. It needs to be like way increased, and people do need to understand, like, because I know many people don't believe in like contraception in Korea, and like, I mean, if you take birth control, it's not always because you're going out and having sex. It's because possibly your period or whatever.
Yeah, you're regulating hormones or whatever.
Just like use protection, do whatever you need to do, because in a society that's so against like unwed pregnancies.
Yeah,
that's the word. Like you should be more educated on sex so that you don't come to these circumstances. But then of course accidents happen and everything like that, I know. But then also like in Korea, I don't know if it's as common now, but I used to volunteer in an orphanage and to teach English as well. But a lot of the children that were there, their parents got remarried. And they put them in the orphanage.
And you see in K-dramas all the time as well, right?
Yeah.
It's like, oh.
I didn't think it was real, but then I was like, whoa, I was like, this is real. I was like, they do this stuff. And I was like, oh my gosh. And so the moms or whatever would just come on the weekends, be like, hey, here's some like bread. All right, see
Bye.
you like next weekend when I'm not with like my husband and
their new family.
And I'm like, I don't understand why you can't get remarried and keep your child. It just doesn't make sense to me.
But then maybe there's also the idea of like purity.
Yeah, you
like,
have to be pure blood.
Yeah.
But I hate to break it to you Koreans, but almost none of you are pure blood. I did a DNA test. I am like 99% Korean, but 1% of me is like Chinese or Japanese. And so it's like, no matter what you do, you will not be pure blood most likely. You can think you are, but go to a DNA test and really find out.
You're really out here challenging them.
I mean,
the perception.
It just drives me insane. They're like pure blood. And I'm like, pure blood does not exist.
In the world.
In the whole entire world. Like nobody's fully anything.
Okay, so we were actually discussing this a while back, and I'd love to hear everyone's opinions on it in terms of South Korea, obviously after the war, children were adopted internationally, and there was, as we were talking about, some like people saying, oh, I'm so sorry, and like, are you okay, essentially. And there was we talked about terminology around adoption. And I believe you asked me if I'd ever encountered adoption and human trafficking being one and the same. And I'd never considered that before. Like when I've discussed adoption and talked with other people about their adoptions and stuff like that, we had never brought up that they felt they were human trafficked or that their adoption was a form of human trafficking. But you, I think, were telling me that's a little bit different for some cases.
So, so there was a news article. I'm not going to say which news article it was, and it was displaying that, it was interviewing an adoptee, and they said like pretty much adoption is a form of human trafficking, which I completely disagree with. But I do think there are cases, of course, with international adoptions that it can be a form of human trafficking. Of course, that can obviously happen. But I think people tend to have this negative viewpoint with adoptions and like combining it with human trafficking, because there have been cases where people have been adopted to, say, America, and then they get deported back to Korea because their parents didn't file the right paperwork and stuff like that. So it's kind of almost like
essentially
they were just
stateless people.
Yeah, and they're just sent, and then they're sent back here, and it's just like, and so they don't have a real good like situation. And then there's also people, there was an organization in Korea that was called the Brothers Home that did sell children for profit. And they made about $20 million off of it. And
because the adoption system in Korea was quite privatized at that time, right? It was like it was not run by governmental agencies. They were private organizations who were kind of exporting these children.
The articles I read about it, like the government was involved with the Brothers organization. I don't know if I can say this on the podcast, but like it was the organization would use organized like private organizations' names on their paperwork to send them abroad. And so I think a lot of adoptees think like are very resentful of their situation, because a lot of their paperwork says like, oh, you were found on the street, nothing else. And so a lot of adoptees are like, I don't think that's the whole story. I need to know more. And there's no more story to it, because they just don't have the more background information. And or maybe they do and they're just not telling them about it. And so I think that some adoptees really do think they're a form of human trafficking because their story just doesn't add up fully. So I think it depends on your situation, but I think it's really poor to have the stigma of international adoptions being a form of human trafficking, because that's not the case for everything. That's saying like every adoption is just terrible no matter what happens, and that's not always the case. Like every situation's different.
But do you think there is a kind of breach of human rights aspect to the whole issue? So for example, the seminar that I attended, they were talking about like adoption as violations of children's rights and their human rights in terms of like their like socioeconomic and cultural rights to belong to a family and to be part of their community and their country. So like, do you have any thoughts on this?
I mean, I think that I don't think it's against our human rights. I think when you're a child, like you don't know anything. And so like if your family has the best interest in mind and they're putting you up for adoption for you to grow up in a better society and you to have a better like upbringing, and then the family who does adopt you has it in their best interest to bring you up in the best way possible, then I don't think it's against human rights, if I'm understanding your question correctly. And I think that as long as when you get old enough, you can go back to the society and you can find out information about yourself. You can find out like your background and stuff like that. I think that's what's important. Like I think adoptees should be able to find out more information about like their birth families and the medical histories and stuff like that. I think that's not fair. I think that's a big thing that's taken away from a lot of people, is like when you go to a doctor, you can't check like, you have to check like, I don't know any family history. So that's kind of like what is wrong.
Right.
So I think if you're adopted, you should be able to, when you're older, you should be able to say like, I want to go back to the country I was born in. I want to find out more information and stuff like that. And I think the adoptive parents and the birth family should be able to provide this for the child. I'm not saying birth parents have to meet you or anything like that, because I don't think that's fair either. But I think that they should have to provide all this information. I'm not saying their names or anything like that. I'm saying like, this is our family history. This is like this stuff that you should be worried about.
Yeah.
But then related to that, then do you think for people who are wanting to adopt as parents, they have to be prepared for all these kinds of situations down the track in the future, and they have to?
Yes.
I'm going to say right off the bat, yes.
100%.
I think a lot of people sometimes see adoption as not
like
easy,
an
but
end thing. It's just kind of like, oh, this child comes into my family, that's it.
Yeah, it's not the same as biological children in terms of like adoption. I don't know how to phrase this correctly. We've had this conversation in terms of, I think some families do see adoption as being a one-time thing in terms of like, you adopt the child is yours. you have a new son or daughter. Yay,
Like
end
the
of
process
story.
is over.
Yeah, that's where it ends. But it doesn't end there. And I don't think I've heard of a single case where the child knows they're adopted and knows that they've been adopted and then does not have questions and that's not where it ends. Like, and then concealing it from the child and not telling the child that they're adopted, I think is also...
That's a violation.
Yeah. I think you should have to tell the child so that
100%.
the child can then start asking questions and start doing those things. And in terms of like your question before, I feel like children they're not informed enough to make decisions for themselves, which is why there are like people are assigned to children to help make them help them make choices in a legal sense. Like they can't represent themselves. So I don't think it's a violation of human rights, but I think not telling your child that they're adopted would be a violation of something.
Right.
If not just a violation of trust for the rest of their lives.
You could have identity problems like I did growing up, convinced that you weren't adopted, even though I look nothing like that. My parents are completely Caucasian. I was like, no, you guys are lying. No way. My dad has black hair, so I was like, yeah, I look like him for sure. I was like, yeah. Well, the problem is I have 2 adopted brothers too, and I was like, yeah, you 2 are adopted, but me,
I'm not though. Not me.
Not possible. But I agree 100% that if you don't tell your child that they're adopted, that's just like one of the most messed up things you could ever do to a child. But I do think parents need to be educated, like really need to be educated about adoption, because I think a lot of parents just like assume their kids aren't going to have issues. Like
they just kind of think it's an easy thing, especially with like media these days, or like like Modern Family. I think it was like a couple in Modern Family adopted a child from like in the TV series. So I think in like media it's not like it's not uncommon, but it's not that common either. I guess it's like becoming more normalized, especially like you said with Angelina Jolie and all these celebrities adopting.
I think there's pro and con to that in terms of like the normalization of it. I'm like, yes, like I don't mind talking about adoption. I don't mind sharing my experiences and helping with the normalization so that when people look at my family, they go, that's a family, as opposed to going like, something's off, but like, I'm not going to ask. Or like some people do ask and they're just like, so, and I'm just like, yeah, yes.
So are you like their cousin?
I'm the next door neighbor, actually.
I've been confused. Like people have been like with my white friends, they'd be like, oh, so like, is your parents, like they think my friend is my parents' daughter. I'm like, no, I'm their daughter. This is my friend. Like, this is my parents. And then you get like confused. I'm like, it's not that hard to understand. Yeah. But I guess it is hard for people to understand.
In terms of it being like becoming more like normalized. Yeah. I think that's also slightly dangerous when you don't show like in TV shows. Like obviously you're not going to show like the reality of it. It's like, it's a comedy show. Like it's not meant to, but at the same time, like one thing that kind of bothers me is when I'm sitting with people and like we're just chatting and like then it turns to like, oh, like one day I want to have a family, and I'm like, awesome. And then they just go like, yeah, I think like I might do this or this, and then they're like, you know what, but maybe I might just adopt. And I'm just like, you say it so casually.
Yeah, it's very
not
like
that easy. Like you need to do these things. You need to like
educate
yourself.
yourself.
It's a process. It's a process, people. Okay.
And like I think that's why certain adoption agencies I would consider to be like more of a gold standard in comparison to others, where like they have to do the family. Like when my parents were considering adoption and then we're going through the process, or my adopted family, they had to go through a long interview process. They had to be vetted. They had to see how, because my parents have a biological child, they had to know how she was going to react. And kind of the same, this is going to be a bad comparison, kind of the same way sometimes when you're getting a dog and you have to introduce a dog.
See if they're going to get along. Are they going to sniff each other's butts or not?
It's kind of like that. Like you're bringing another human being into a family, into someone's life. And like, and that's another thing that I don't think sometimes parents think about. They think they want a child, but it's kind of different in terms of like if you choose to have a child versus adopting a child who will already grow up feeling a little bit out of place just from either looking different or knowing that it's a bit different. And then if you have a sibling who's a biological sibling and doesn't want another sibling,
Different story.
like sometimes parents just kind of have to consider too, like you might want a child, but adoption isn't going to just like magically solve everything or have your biological or other child suddenly be like, yeah, I want a sibling too. It's like, you're not shopping for children. If you're shopping for children, then you are human trafficking.
Yeah.
Then you are shopping for children.
But I agree. It's just people need to be more educated on the process of adoption, how to adopt, like, and the consequences. There are consequences when it comes to adoption. Like, I knew so many people who were just resentful towards their adoptive parents and everything like that. So it just, you have to be more educated.
Education, supporting of mothers. There's a lot.
The whole
supporting of
construction
adoptees.
Society, government, education, financing, everything kind of ties together.
Exactly.
It's very complicated and broad issues that we're trying to tackle today.
Something happened.
I will get to the bottom of it someday.
Well, we look forward to reading your paper when it's released.
Please don't.
Dr. Erin Underwood in the future. We look forward to it.
Bringing on the Yonsei Underwood name.
So in this podcast, we touched on many different things. We covered some things. We avoided others. I hope that we scratched the surface for at least some of these topics. They're so large and they're so big that I don't think we could sit here for 24 hours.
For days to
and
just discuss this.
Probably still miss something.
Yeah.
But I want to thank Erin for taking time out of her day to come attend, and Simone for being here. This was very informative. I learned a lot.
It was fun.
Everyone takes something away. I hope you guys take something away. So thank you again, and be sure to subscribe to NOVAsia, and we'll see you on our next podcast.
Yeah.